Theme Parks, Part 2. There are about a trillion gold atoms in a cubic meter of gold. The US has over $10 trillion of debt. There are about 400 billion galaxies in the universe, which is about 14 billion years old. There are about 400 billion cells in a human brain, a few years old. The average galaxy has about 400 billion stars. The average human cell has about 400 billion atoms. A human cell is about 1/100th the size of a 1 millimeter wide grain of sand. How can we visualize, appreciate, and understand such big and such small numbers that we encounter each day? Theme parks are facilities that provide a visual representation of such big and such small numbers. Theme parks can be set up anywhere where there is a 100-meter-long path. Theme parks allow us a better feel for the sizes of many small objects that many have only heard about and have only seen in pictures. 1 millimeter is the width of a fine grain of sand. 1/10 of the grain of sand is the width of a strand of hair. If the grain of sand would be 100 meters wide, the strand of hair would be 10 meters wide. 1/100th of the grain of sand is the width of a cell. If the grain of sand would be 100 meters wide, the cell would be 1 meter wide. 1/1000th of the grain of sand is the width of a bacteria. If the grain of sand would be 100 meters wide, the bacteria would be 10 centimeters wide. 1/10th of the width of a bacteria is the size of a virus. If the grain of sand would be 100 meters wide, the virus would be 1 centimeter wide. 1/100th of the width of a bacteria is the size of DNA. If the grain of sand would be 100 meters wide, DNA would be 1 millimeter wide. 1/1000th of the width of a bacteria is the size of a molecule. If the bacteria would be 100 meters wide, the molecule would be 10 centimeters wide. 1/10 of the size of a molecule is the size of an atom. If the bacteria would be 100 meters wide, the atom would be 1 centimeters wide. Theme parks allow us a better feel for sizes of many large objects made by man and carved and grown by nature that many have only heard about and only seen in pictures. Stonehenge of England is 4 meters high, 2 meters wide, and 1 meter thick. They are sandstone blocks 25 tons heavy. The Big Pyramid in Egypt is 150 meters high, 230 meters wide at the base, and is made of 2.3 million limestone blocks. The Great Wall of China is 8 meters high, 5 meters wide, and 20,000 kilometers long. The Taj Mahal is a 170-meter high marble mausoleum. The Statue of Liberty is 90 meters high and is made of copper. The Eiffel Tower is 325 meters high and is made of steel. The Dubai Tower is over 800 meters high and about 200 meters wide at the base. Giant redwood trees can grow almost 100 meters high, can reach 7 meters wide, and be 3,000 years old. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco is almost 250 meters high, 30 meters wide, and 3 kilometers long. The Grand Canyon is 800 meters deep, 20 kilometers wide, and 400 kilometers long. Time is a man-made concept that acts like a clock. It is used to measure the motions of energy and matter through space, where they are at any moment, where they were, where they will be, and how fast they are moving. Bees flap their wings 250 times a second. Propellers spin their blade 60 revolutions per second. Winks or blinks take 1/10 of a second. A year has about 30 million seconds. Our universe is 14 billion years old, or 4.2 million trillion winks. The time walk in the Think Park takes you through time from the Big Bang of the birth of our universe to its whimpering future. 1 meter corresponds to about 300 years. The start point in the Think Park marks the beginning. About 14 billion years ago, there was a quantum fluctuation like an unexpected hiccup. The universe was born in a Big Bang. The universe exploded and stretched, and many small bangs quantized space with particles and antiparticles, and they jostled until they annihilated one another, like soldiers in battle. But the birth of the universe was not perfect, for there was a tiny fraction more particles than antiparticles, and an ash of particles remained behind to coalesce and take form that coalesced into mass. Mass gravitated into clumps of different sizes, and the clumps spun around and got hot and ignited into stars. Stars burnt like an oven and spewed forth atoms of all sizes like pastry. Atoms spewed from burnt-out stars gravitated and aggregated and reincarnated into new stars. 14,000 kilometers from the Think Park, 4.5 billion years ago, our sun was born. A tiny fraction of the atoms were left behind and formed rings around the sun like a fence, and with time they bumped, stuck, and rolled up to form planets. A planet called Earth remained near a star called Sun, following it like a child follows her mother. The heat from the sun shone on her and evaporated water, which rose up in the air, moved, and fell as rain. The rain baptized her, bathed her, and made lakes, rivers, and oceans to cool her. Gases raised up and covered her with a warm blanket of air. When the crust of the earth cracked, liquid rock below oozed to the surface above the waters, solidified, and formed land. Weather carved the land and slowly eroded the rocks, forming sand. 10,000 kilometers from the Think Park, about 4 billion years ago, a soup of atoms brewed, cooking basic building blocks of life that grouped and prospered and evolved. The molecules of life grouped and formed cells. With time, cells were able to sense their environment and move where they needed to. So they swam around looking for the sustenance of energy and fled from the discomforts of danger. They grew in size to increase their awareness of their environment until they were too big to contain in one mass. The cells then made communication networks with each other, and in this way, groups of cells formed multicellular organisms. The cells, having support of other cells, evolved specialized functions. A few gradually wiggled out of the seas and discovered land, and others wiggled from land and took to the air. They evolved to exploit their new environment. 600 meters from the Think Park, about 200,000 years ago, one unique life form called man evolved. Men developed to a point where they were able to exploit their environment and move to wherever they wanted to. The more they moved, the more curious they got, until they moved to every continent there was to move to. They had freedom to want, to desire, to wish, to hope, and to believe. And they eventually evolved to exploit their environment. 13 meters from the start point in the Think Park, about 4,000 years ago, a talented man called Abraham was born, who had very much compassion for his animals. He tamed them and used them to cross vast stretches of desert that were uncrossable before, and he discovered unknown lands that he settled in. When asked which gods guided him so well to success, he claimed that it was none of the gods they knew, but a new personal god who claimed to work alone, named Jehovah. Jehovah was not really a new god, but a new addition of a lonely god who claimed to be superior to the other gods. This new addition to the family of gods was adopted by Abraham. Many joined his group and adopted his god as their own. They traveled to many lands, and their unity made them very prosperous. One group traveled to a faraway land called Egypt, settled there, and prospered. Many centuries later, a king of Egypt saw he could exploit these hard-working people and conquered them and made them work like slaves for life. 11 meters from the start point in the think park, about 600 years later, a slave called Moses was born in Egypt who had very much compassion for his fellow slaves. Listening to his intuition and using his wisdom, he was able to unite the slaves. He knew that united they would stand, but divided they would fall, and he united the fleeing slaves with morals that directed people to respect nature. Moses, with the slaves he freed, spent an entire generation looking for the very best land to settle in. When they found it, they killed the inhabitants and claimed the land as their own. The land became very prosperous, and the people who were once slaves became very rich and famous all over the world. When asked which gods guided them so well to prosperity, their leaders claimed that it was the personal God of Abraham. Seeing the power of this new God, people quickly converted and adapted the morals of these prosperous people, and they all prospered in the land they called Judea. They were called Jews. 8 meters from the start point in the think park, about 1,000 years later, a son of the king of Nepal was born. Gautama Buddha was a very sensitive child. Seeing suffering for the very first time when he was 30 years old left him devastated. He came to believe that suffering was caused by people confusing their wants with their needs. He had everything and wanted nothing but inner peace. And there were poor, sick men who had nothing and needed everything. Through meditation, Buddha saw that we would all suffer less if we accepted what we were given by God and not desired anything else, believing what we are given is what we really need. He preached that suffering is an inherent part of existence and that the origin of suffering is greed. 7 meters from the start point in the think park, about 300 years later, the quest for knowledge reached a peak. A new breed of men called philosophers evolved. One of the greatest was the private teacher of Alexander the Great of Greece. Aristotle claimed that knowledge must be sought, captured, and accumulated. Under Aristotle's tutelage, Alexander found knowledge from faraway civilizations and accumulated it in great libraries for all mankind to exploit. Aristotle claimed that money was not a commodity of trade, but rather a law of measure, claiming that money should not be equated with wealth, but rather considered a human right. Aristotle claimed that we can gain understanding by investigation and extrapolation of our observations by reason and logic. As an example, he concluded that the sun revolved around the earth by observing it during the day and extrapolating its movement during the night. By observing an apple and a leaf fall, he concluded that heavy objects fall faster than lighter objects. 6 meters from the start point in our think park, about 300 years later, a poor but generous Jew was born called Jesus, who had very much compassion for his fellow man. He saw too much greed in his fellow Jews and too much arrogance. Listening to his intuition and using his wisdom, he tried to unite all people, Jews and non-Jews. While Jews jealously guarded their God as only theirs, this rebel Jew, Jesus, offered it to everyone. While Jews had an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth morals, the rebel Jews insisted that it is better to get 2 slaps than to lose 2 eyes, and this was so radical to other Jews, people following this rebel were called Christians. Their belief was called Christianity. Jesus' rebellion caused the Jews to be divided, and soon after, they were not powerful enough to protect themselves. They were conquered and dispersed all over the world. Jesus offered man a new morality for uniting all of man with nature so that he may live more and more in peace in an everlasting, shrinking world. He taught we must love nature that provides for all people, and we must love all her people, even if they are our enemies. He claimed that if we follow his message, we will one day find an everlasting peace. He warned and prophesied that if we do not follow his message of salvation, the world would end up just like it actually did. About 400 years later, Attila was born. He was a Mongolian boy in a family of rulers and kings of the Huns, a union of nomadic tribes stretching from Mongolia to Turkey along the Siberian plains. They hunted with bows and arrows on horseback, and as they rode into new territories, they gained a reputation for plundering and pillaging. They expanded to the outskirts of the Roman Empire, where they were considered barbarians, the Hell's Angels of their time. The Romans hired them whenever they needed fearless soldiers to police their outposts. Attila's relatives over many generations grew to be rulers of Europe. Charlemagne was the greatest of them. Charlemagne lived 300 years later and had 20 children with 8 of his 10 known wives. He became the founding father of all European monarchies. About 200 years later, in 600 AC, at the 4-meter mark in our Think Park, an inspired man called Mohammed was born in a part of the world where the people were very divided. They were neither Jews nor Christians. He needed his people to be as united as the Jews and as meek as the Christians. So he listened to his intuition and was able to unite his people under the same God that both Jews and Christians followed. They called their belief Islam, and people called them Muslims. They prospered and blossomed to a great civilization known for their gifted scientists. Christian leaders took great offense, and for 200 years, Christians and Muslims crusaded and killed each other in the name of the same God. In 1099 after Christ, the Jews and Muslims fought together to defend Jerusalem against the invading Crusaders from Europe. They were unsuccessful, and the Crusaders entered the city and proceeded to massacre the remaining Jewish and Muslim civilians and pillaged and destroyed mosques and the city itself. This started 200 years of crusades that were bloodier and bloodier with each century. About 100 years later, the Catholic Church set up inquisitions which were attempts to convict heretics such as Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their Jewish or Muslim faith. Christian healers, called witches, using natural healing practices, were also considered heretics. Any Christian could accuse any other Christian of heresy merely on suspicions without having to show any evidence. During the Inquisition, the accused were psychologically and physically tortured until they died or confessed their sins and incriminated other people of heresy. Then they would be imprisoned for long periods, fined large amounts of money and forced to wear a mark showing that they had sinned. Those that did not confess and survive their torture were burnt alive. This barbaric cruel practice lasted for the next 700 years. Genghis Khan, at about the 3-meter mark in the Think Park, was born in 1160 after Christ in Mongolia. He learned how to ride horses before he could walk. By 6, he could hunt and fish. He was able to unite and organize many nomadic tribes. He grouped them into gangs of 10, bands of 100, and battalions of 1,000. He commanded a league of 10 battalions, considered the most powerful and feared army of his time. One of the Chinese emperors hired his army, and they prospered and became famous for their fierce fighting power. They ended up breaching the Great Wall of China and conquered the entire country, and his empire covered almost all of Asia. In 1349, the Black Death, one of the worst pandemics in human history, killing half of the population, reached Switzerland, and the Swiss blamed the Jews for starting it, accusing them of poisoning water wells. A systematic extermination program was started, and Jews were burnt alive at the stake, and their wealth was expropriated. This fear, hatred, blame, extermination, and expropriation spread with the plague to the rest of Europe like a wildfire. At the 2-meter mark of the Think Park, one very clever man called Gutenberg was born in 1398 and developed a machine that was able to mass produce indulgences. That made him and the church very rich. He used his wealth to mass produce Bibles that were in Latin, and except for a few priests, only a few people could read them. The printing presses and the books they produced in local languages after Gutenberg died lighted and fired men's minds all over the world. Knowledge exploded, and many thinking people began to think and to write books to protect their exploitation. Christians that protested kept their God but rejected their church leaders. They were called Protestants. Over the centuries, they kept on protesting, eventually forming thousands of separate groups. Over time, empires divided and gradually regrouped into smaller groups called nations. People all over the world began to struggle against the exploitation and slaughter to fight for their freedom. By 1500 after Christ, the greed of mankind evolved to great heights. They were able to build and sail ships over the oceans. One king saw that he could now exploit new lands. He sent one poor brave man called Columbus, born in 1451, to explore the world for new lands to exploit. Columbus discovered a continent filled with gold and fertile farmland. He conquered the land and called it America. Martin Luther, born in 1483 in Germany, was a priest who believed that sin cannot be bought off by buying indulgences. He used Gutenberg's old printing press to print the Bible in German to be read by the masses for the very first time. Many people reading the Bible for the first time had a differing interpretation of it and felt that Jesus deserved more exaltation, and that Mary, his mother, was unduly glorified, and that luxurious temples filled with gold statues and paintings of nude angels were not appropriate as churches. Luther, like many other priests, did not like to lead a celibate life, so with time they protested, broke away from the church, and became Protestants. They built their own less pretentious temples and traded the nude statues for wives. Luther tried to convert Jews to accept Jesus as their Messiah, and the more the Jews stubbornly refused to accept Jesus, the more Luther saw Jews as a cancer that must be eradicated from Germany. He printed many pamphlets calling for the marking of all Jews by making them wear a yellow armband. Later, he even proposed burning their homes and called for their extermination. Galileo Galilei, born in 1564, studied Aristotle and learned from him that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. He made experiments from a tall tower with different materials, from balls filled with lead to balls filled with air, and discovered that they all fell at the same rate. Aristotle also claimed that the sun rotated around the earth. Galileo studied the heavens and discovered that the earth rotated around the sun, just like a Polish astronomer Copernicus wrote 50 years before. Galileo invented many instruments that later allowed scientists to explore the unknown. He observed that light and images are shrunk and expanded by polished glass. He made large pendulum devices that measured time very exactly in order to measure the motion of stars. He observed and theorized a law called the law of inertia, refuting Aristotle's claim that bodies in motion gradually lose their motion and eventually end up still. At the 1 meter mark in the Think Park, a few years after Galileo died, Isaac Newton was born. Newton developed a language of mathematics called calculus that was like a combination of art and poetry that described motion. 150 years later, James Watt tamed the pressure of steam to make machines more powerful than many teams of horses. This invention opened up the doors to the Industrial Revolution. 50 years after that, Michael Faraday tamed the pressure of electrons to make machines even smaller than steam engines. Charles Babbage used electric machines to communicate with other electric machines to form computing machines. Mathematicians had now a tool that allowed them to model anything they wanted with formulas. This opened the door to the information revolution 35 years later. James Maxwell discovered that moving electrons and wires emitted a very bright invisible light, much like a tuning fork emits a sound. This emission radiated in space, traveling thousands of kilometers. He built devices that were able to detect this energy. Electric machines allowed man to communicate over great distances. This invention opened up the doors to the communication revolution. Within 300 years, man would describe the motion of atoms. Albert Einstein used computing machines and his imagination and intuition to refine Newton's formulas to describe the motion of protons, electrons, and atoms. He defined the relationship of mass and energy. His theories allowed man to build many very powerful machines like lasers and nuclear bombs that opened the door to the nuclear revolution and the communications revolution, allowing mass media to enter the scene. Music, like a drug, drove man to leap, but not to the highest, furthest, or most lucrative place, but to the most beautiful one. In the middle of the 18th century, superstar musicians entertaining kings gradually started to stretch their wings. Some who stretched found a degree of freedom that beckoned them on to heights never before reached. Haydn was one of the first to carve out roads still used by pioneers, breaking new ground. With the push and the tug of Mozart, Beethoven, and Strauss, Liszt took these steps a leap further. He used music from gypsies singing and dancing around campfires under the glittering stars. He adapted his music to be played in golden-walled concert halls under glittering chandeliers so that it was heard by kings. This new feeling of freedom that this new music gave the people was enough to incite them to demand and fight for their political freedom, and to rebel against injustices to the death. In 1948, there was a series of political upheavals called freedom revolts throughout Europe, which spread to South America. Over 50 countries were affected, but with no coordination or cooperation among the revolutionaries in the different countries, the revolutions collapsed after a year. The mass media became the message. The mass media that transmitted messages to the masses itself became no more than just a message, because the greedy people controlling the media started to control the messages as well. As cheap, meaningless messages were more profitable than valuable, useful ones, most of the messages brought little benefit to mankind. The people became complacent and preferred to see and listen instead of to read and write. It was seen that controlling people with the media was more effective than controlling them with fear. And just when the mass media devices became available to exploit, they were exploited by two very greedy and brutal leaders called Hitler and Stalin. By 1939, the two were able to use fear with mass media to brainwash people all over the world to fear and hate and kill each other. Stalin slaughtered over 6 million people like cattle for fear of opposing political views. Hitler burned 6 million Jews in ovens for fear of contamination of race. The richest of the Jews managed to escape to America, where they prospered. Judea was given back to the Jews as compensation for being almost exterminated. Their land was wasted in their absence, and they soon restored it to its former glory and made it fertile once more. They disenfranchised the inhabitants and renamed the land Israel. We cannot know the future for certain, except for the fact that everything living dies and everything non-living gets cold, disintegrates, and gets spread out over space. We can often learn from the past and be able to better guess what lies ahead. Continents keep moving, and it is not possible to change their momentum and movement. Africa continues to slide over and into Europe, and in 100,000 years the Mediterranean Sea will have dried up. In 1,000,000 years, technetium-99, the waste byproduct of the present nuclear power plants, which possess a danger when inhaled, will have decayed and will have ceased to be a threat. Several kilometer-sized asteroids and comets on collision courses with Earth, however, will become a new and even greater threat to man's well-being, if he is still here to be threatened. In 100 million years, the continents we are so familiar with will be unrecognizable. In 1,000,000,000 years, as if to celebrate the evolution of fish, plants, and fungi from the sponges 1,000,000,000 years before, the sun will become too hot for life of any kind. It will evaporate the oceans, and man will be forced to leave Earth and look for new solar systems to exploit. The last one to leave will have no need to turn off the lights.